Textbooks present prehistory as a neat staircase: farms, villages, temples, cities, intellect. Unfortunately, Stone disagreed. Today, we open 10 case files on prehistoric structures that rupture that timeline. The first 9 humiliate easy assumptions. The final file asks why civilization needed permission to exist. Chapter 1. Göbekli Tepe. The temple before the farm. Case file number 1. You stand on a limestone hill near Şanlıurfa, in southeastern Turkey, with the sun pressing down on the dust and a German archaeologist staring at stones that should have been ordinary. Klaus Schmidt did not arrive here to rescue a fantasy. He arrived to excavate a problem. Around you, the ground has been opened into circles, not huts, not storage pits, not the modest debris of people politely waiting for civilization to begin. Tall T-shaped pillars rise from the earth like silent bodies. Some wear carved arms. Some carry foxes, snakes, boars, birds, scorpions, creatures moving across stone with a confidence that makes the phrase primitive art sound like a clerical error. The stakes are not decorative. If this anomaly is verified in the way Schmidt understood it, the timeline taught to children does not need a small correction in the margin. It needs to be pulled apart and rebuilt from the foundation. Because Göbekli Tepe does not ask whether prehistoric people could worship. It asks whether worship, ritual, and shared symbolic obsession may have helped create the conditions for settled life itself. The official name is Göbekli Tepe, a pre-pottery Neolithic site in Upper Mesopotamia. Its main activity falls roughly between 9,600 and 8,200 BC. Several limestone T-pillars reach about 5.5 meters in height. The structures were made before pottery, before metal tools, before fully developed urban life, using local limestone carved with stone and bone implements. In one neat cluster, the facts become uncomfortable. 10,000 years old, monumental enclosures, anthropomorphic pillars, carved animals, no bronze, no writing, no kingdom. Excellent. A temple complex before the farm had properly filled out its paperwork. The physical contradiction is brutally simple. Archaeology long preferred a clean sequence. First, humans domesticate crops. Then, farming creates surplus. Surplus supports settled villages. Villages produce hierarchy. Hierarchy builds temples. Temples then produce organized religion, ideology, and officials who stand near sacred buildings explaining why everyone else should carry rocks. Göbekli Tepe disturbs this arrangement. It suggests that large-scale ritual cooperation may have existed before the full agricultural package matured. It does not prove that hunter-gatherers lived in a magical golden age of cosmic wisdom. That is the other lazy story, wearing incense. What it proves is colder. Small, mobile, or semi-mobile communities could coordinate labor, transmit symbolic systems, and return to important places with enough consistency to build something no one needed for shelter. That is the engineering problem. A pillar does not quarry itself. Limestone does not politely become architecture because someone had a spiritual feeling near breakfast. The builders had to select stone, extract it, shape it, move it, raise it, arrange it, and repeat the process through multiple building phases. They had to feed workers, remember plans, maintain shared meanings, and persuade enough people that this hill mattered more than whatever urgent problem waited elsewhere. This is where the primitive survival model becomes embarrassing. Hunter-gatherers were not brainless stomachs with legs. They tracked seasons, animals, water, territory, kinship, and danger. Their intelligence was not lower than ours. It was aimed at different problems. Modern people forget this because we confuse paperwork with cognition. We assume that if a society does not leave tax records, it must have been intellectually casual. A tragic prejudice. Also convenient because it allows bureaucracies to crown themselves as the birth of reason. The political layer is not a conspiracy with a villain hiding files in a temple basement. The erasure is more refined. It comes from academic habit, old models, national narratives, and the comfort of linear progress. Prehistory is often taught as a slow software update. Humans start simple, install farming, upgrade to villages, unlock temples, then purchase civilization. Göbekli Tepe behaves like a corrupted file in that system. It appears too early. It is too organized. It makes ritual look like a driver of social complexity, not merely a luxury item bought with agricultural surplus. Who would fear that? Not one king, not one priest. The threatened authority is the modern educational myth that civilization is a neat staircase from hunger to management. Göbekli Tepe implies that humans may gather around meaning before they gather around fields. It suggests that symbols can organize bodies before states organize citizens. That is a dangerous idea because it makes power look less like the inventor of order and more like one later manager of a much older human talent. And then there is the burial. At some point, the monumental enclosures were intentionally filled in. The site was not simply forgotten like a misplaced tool. It was covered. Whether this was ritual closure, social transformation, abandonment, or something more practical, the result was the same. The hill swallowed the evidence, and for thousands of years, the official timeline remained safe from embarrassment. Very considerate of the hill. The textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the math completely breaks down. Hunter-gatherers, we are often told, were too busy chasing lunch to organize large monuments. Apparently, between not inventing pottery and not founding a state, these people found time to quarry limestone, carve symbolic animals, arrange circular enclosures, and sabotage 10,000 years of academic confidence. Very careless of them. To be fair, mainstream caution exists for a reason. Göbekli Tepe should not be inflated into a lost super-civilization. There is no evidence here for aliens, vanished Atlanteans, or bearded engineers arriving with laser levels and suspiciously modern emotional problems. The cautious alternatives are more interesting. Perhaps ritual feasting drew groups together across the region. Perhaps sacred landscapes stabilized seasonal movement. Perhaps the labor itself created alliances, obligations, and social memory powerful enough to make settlement more attractive. In each version, the temple does not wait at the end of civilization. It stands near the beginning of a new social experiment. So what exactly was being built on that hill? A sanctuary, a gathering machine, a territorial claim, or a social contract carved in limestone? If people without kings could raise monuments like this, how much authority did later rulers actually invent? And how much did they merely capture? And why do modern societies keep needing ancient people to be less intelligent than they were? Göbekli Tepe leaves us with a hard, unpleasant lesson. Human cooperation does not begin when someone writes a law. It begins when enough people believe the same invisible thing strongly enough to move stone. And once that is understood, the next problem becomes impossible to ignore. Because if ritual could organize labor before farming fully matured, then public works may also have appeared before public administration learned to introduce itself. The trail moves south, toward an older settlement by a spring, where a tower rises from the Neolithic ground like bureaucracy's embarrassing ancestor. Chapter 2. Jericho Tower. Public works before public administration. The second anomaly on our list takes us to a spring-fed mound in the Jordan Valley. You stand at Tel Es Sultan, ancient Jericho, where heat rises from the ground and the past refuses to stay in its assigned biblical lane. A British archaeologist, Kathleen Kenyon, cuts into the mound in the 1950s with the discipline of someone trying to separate history from inherited thunder. This was not easy work. Jericho was already overloaded with expectation. Walls, trumpets, prophets, conquest, the usual dramatic furniture of sacred storytelling. But beneath those later narratives, Kenyon found something older, quieter, and more disturbing. A pre-biblical settlement with monumental stone architecture from a world that had no writing, no kings, no formal state, and apparently no concern for what modern textbooks would find convenient. If this anomaly is verified, then the polite sequence of administration before infrastructure begins to collapse. Because Jericho's tower does not ask whether early villagers lived together. It asks how people built public works before the familiar tools of public administration existed. The site is Tel Es Sultan, near a perennial spring at ancient Jericho. Its monumental features belong to the 9th and 8th millennium BC. The stone tower stands about 5 meters high. The early wall was several meters tall and accompanied by a ditch cut into the landscape. All of this belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic, before ceramic technology became common in the region. In one short inventory, a spring, a settlement, a wall, a ditch, an 8.5-meter tower. No pottery bureaucracy, no royal inscription, no Office of Municipal Planning. A beginner village, apparently. The kind of beginner village that begins by moving stone, cutting ditches, raising towers, and making the future look underemployed. The contradiction is not that Jericho existed early. People had settled near water before. The contradiction is the level of coordinated investment. A tower is not a campfire. A wall is not a casual weekend gesture. A ditch is not made because 3 neighbors had spare time and a shared enthusiasm for blisters. These features imply planning, division of labor, technical memory, and some form of collective obligation. What was the wall for? Archaeologists still debate it. Defense is the familiar answer. Flood control is another possibility. Symbolic boundary making has also been proposed. Perhaps it did several jobs at once because ancient people were allowed to be efficient before modern categories arrived to simplify them into cartoons. The engineering difficulty begins with mass. Stone had to be gathered, shaped, transported, stacked, stabilized, and integrated with the settlement. A tower rising 5 meters in the Neolithic required not only physical labor, but social continuity. Someone had to decide where it went. Someone had to understand slope, access, structure, and maintenance. Someone had to convince others that the project mattered enough to interrupt the daily tasks of food, water, tool repair, childcare, conflict, ritual, and not dying. That last one was popular. And yet Jericho did it, before common pottery, before scribes, before royal decrees, before the reassuring modern fantasy that infrastructure begins when a government department prints a logo. This is the deeper problem. We often explain public works by pointing to institutions. Kings command, priests justify. Officials count, laborers obey. The system is unpleasant but legible. Jericho gives us infrastructure without the later administrative costume. The builders had no surviving written constitution, no tax ledger, no monument inscription announcing that a ruler with a long name had improved flood resilience for the glory of his household. There is only architecture, silence, stone, coordination. So what power organized it? The answer may have been practical. The settlement needed protection, water management, or boundary control. But practicality alone does not explain why a community sustains labor at this scale. There must have been a shared idea of belonging, a sense that the settlement was not merely where people happened to sleep, but a place worth defending, defining, and remembering. Jericho may show the birth of public identity before the birth of public paperwork. The political layer is subtle. Later civilizations claimed monumentality as the signature of the state. Walls became emblems of kings. Towers became expressions of authority. Urban planning became evidence of government. Jericho interrupts that inheritance. It says that collective architecture can emerge from communal pressure before political hierarchy hardens into official power. No wonder the oldest layers became background noise. Jericho's later fame swallowed its earlier problem. Once a site is attached to a famous sacred story, older archaeology is forced to sit politely in the footnotes while trumpets get the headline. The Neolithic tower disappears beneath the drama of later walls, later wars, later theology, and later people who were very confident that history began when their preferred text began mentioning things. Narrative gravity is a powerful eraser. It does not destroy evidence. It simply teaches the public where not to look. The textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the math completely breaks down. Early villagers, we are told, built walls because they were beginning to settle down. Yes, a modest little settlement, experimenting with permanence by constructing a tower, wall, ditch, and water-adjacent public system before common pottery. Very humble. Practically a picnic with masonry. To be fair, Orthodox archaeology does not claim Jericho had a palace state hiding under the mud. The caution is correct. We should not project later urban systems backward and dress Neolithic people in bureaucratic uniforms. There is no need to imagine a forgotten empire at Jericho. The safer hypotheses are more precise. Perhaps the wall helped manage seasonal flooding. Perhaps it marked social space and separated insiders from outsiders. Perhaps the tower had ritual, defensive, observational, or communal significance. Perhaps the entire complex worked as a machine for making a settlement feel permanent. That possibility is the most dangerous one. Humans do not become social because a state orders them to be. States arrive later and take credit. Before them, people were already binding themselves to places, building shared obligations into stone, and discovering that architecture could turn a group into a community. Jericho forces 3 questions into the open. How much organization can exist before formal government becomes visible? How many early public works have been misread because they lack the paperwork we expect from power? And if a wall can define a community before a state exists, is civilization a legal category or a behavior pattern? The takeaway is simple and irritating. Infrastructure may be older than the institutions we use to explain it. People built systems before they built offices. They managed space before they managed records. They made place itself into authority. And from that spring-fed settlement, the investigation turns toward a harsher landscape, where stone circles rise not beside permanent water, but in a desert that was once alive with rain, cattle, movement, and skywatching. If Jericho suggests public works before administration, Nabta Playa suggests something even more offensive to the textbook staircase: astronomy before pharaohs. Chapter 3, Nabta Playa. The Desert Calendar. before the Pharaohs. Our third stop breaks the timeline in a desert that used to remember water. You stand west of Abu Simbel in southern Egypt's western desert, where the horizon looks empty until the stones begin to arrange themselves into intention. There are circles, alignments, tumuli, cattle burials, and the faint outline of a vanished world that modern maps describe as desert, because modern maps have very little respect for former weather. Fred Wendorf, Romuald Schild, and J. McKim Malville entered this landscape under a special kind of pressure. Say too much, and the site becomes bait for cosmic exaggeration. Say too little, and it disappears under the older, shinier story of Egypt, where pharaohs get temples, pyramids, inscriptions, gold masks, and excellent branding. But Nabta Playa has no need to compete with royal Egypt. Its crime is earlier and quieter. If this anomaly is verified, then astronomy did not wait politely for palace priests, dynastic calendars, or men in linen explaining the heavens from inside state temples. It may have begun with pastoral communities watching rain, cattle, death, movement, and the seasonal sky because survival tends to encourage observation. A shocking method. Looking up, the site is Nabta Playa in southern Egypt's western desert, roughly west of Abu Simbel. Its major ceremonial activity belongs to the late and terminal Neolithic. The complex includes stone circles, megalithic alignments, tumuli, and cattle burial. Some research interprets the stone circle as roughly aligned toward the summer solstice sunrise. Most importantly, the landscape was not always the hyper-arid desert seen today. It belonged to a seasonal, wetter Sahara, where people moved with water, grazing, and time. In one tight evidence cluster, Neolithic pastoralists, stone circles, possible solstice alignment, ceremonial cattle burials, a changing Sahara, and no pharaoh in sight. Inconvenient. The Nile Valley had not yet received its monopoly license on Egyptian significance. The physical contradiction lies in the kind of people involved. Mobile or semi-mobile pastoral groups are often imagined as socially flexible, materially light, and too dependent on seasonal movement to create durable ceremonial landscapes. Yet Nabta Playa suggests repeated gathering, shared ritual geography, and possibly astronomical reference points. This was not a random scatter of rocks produced by boredom and unfortunate heat stroke. It was a structured landscape. The engineering was not impossible in the modern sense. No one needed cranes, steel, or orbital mathematics. But the difficulty was social. Stones had to be selected, moved, placed, and remembered. Alignments, if intentional, required observation over time. Ceremonial locations had to matter across seasons. Cattle burials had to carry symbolic weight. A mobile community had to return often enough for the site to become a calendar, a shrine, a meeting point, or all three at once. That is the part the primitive model struggles to digest. It wants architecture to grow out of cities and astronomy to grow out of states. Nabta Playa suggests something less flattering to civilization's resume. People who depend on rain are not casually interested in the sky. They are professionally interested. The sun, stars, and seasonal cycles are not abstract science when your animals, food, roots, and rituals depend on them. They are infrastructure, just without stone walls and a committee. The deeper layer is political, but not in the usual palace intrigue sense. The power being challenged is the Nile-centric story of Egypt. Egyptology has traditionally loved the valley. Temples, kings, dynasties, tombs, inscriptions, and stone monuments large enough to make tourists feel obedient. The Western Desert, by contrast, seems peripheral, empty, marginal, a place where the real civilization was not supposed to be doing anything important yet. This is how geography becomes erasure. The Nile received the spotlight because it produced the archive, texts, monuments, royal names, and durable symbols of centralized power. Nabta Playa produced stones in a desert that later dried, emptied, and lost the living context that made the site intelligible. When the Green Sahara retreated, memory became archaeology. Then dynastic Egypt inherited the stage and behaved, as dominant civilizations often do, as if the lighting had always belonged to it. Climate did some of the erasing. Prestige did the rest. There is also a religious monopoly hidden inside the timeline. Later priesthoods often appear as the official keepers of celestial knowledge. Calendars become temple knowledge. Sky cycles become sacred administration. The ability to predict time becomes power, because whoever controls the calendar controls planting, ritual, taxation, festivals, and fear. Nabta Playa threatens that neat inheritance by suggesting that sky knowledge may have older roots in seasonal survival, cattle movement, and communal gathering. In other words, the priest may not have invented the calendar. He may have inherited it, refined it, and then stood beside it wearing better clothing. The textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the math completely breaks down. Astronomy begins, we are told, when state civilizations require calendars. Or, with unbearable simplicity, people who depended on rain, grazing cycles, and seasonal movement noticed that the giant fireball in the sky had habits. The Academy calls this archaeoastronomy. The rest of us may call it paying attention. To be fair, caution matters here. Nabta Playa should not be inflated into an Egyptian Stonehenge with secret priest scientists mapping the galaxy for a lost civilization. Some alignments remain debated. Interpretation is difficult. A desert stone circle does not automatically become an observatory because modern people enjoy mystery with their documentaries. That is how bad history breeds in warm lighting. The cautious alternatives are stronger. Perhaps the stones marked seasonal gatherings rather than precise astronomical events. Perhaps the solstice association was approximate but meaningful. Perhaps cattle burials tied cosmology, wealth, mobility, and ritual into one landscape. Perhaps Nabta Playa was not a calendar in the narrow modern sense, but a social machine for organizing time, movement, and memory. That version is more powerful because it does not require fantasy. It requires only that prehistoric people be competent. Apparently, this remains difficult. Nabta Playa leaves 3 questions burning in the sand. When did humans first turn the sky from scenery into a schedule? How much early science has been mislabeled as religion because it did not arrive with equations? And if survival created astronomy before states professionalized it, how many later civilizations were only formalizing knowledge that older communities had already built through necessity? The lesson is sharp. Astronomy may not have begun as royal science. It may have begun as survival intelligence watched from open land by people who had to know when the world would change. Long before pharaohs carved their names into stone, someone in the Sahara was already reading the sky like a contract. And from that desert calendar, the investigation moves northwest across time and coastline to Brittany, where thousands of stones stretch over kilometers, forming a landscape so vast that calling it a monument almost sounds lazy. Nabta Playa gives us the sky as memory. Carnac gives us memory turned into geography. Chapter 4. Carnac, the Kilometer-Scale memory machine. Dossier number 4 opens on the coast of Brittany. You walk between rows of stones near Carnac where the Atlantic air moves across fields, villages, roads, fences, tourists, and more ancient granite than any tidy explanation can comfortably digest. The stones do not form one monument. They form a landscape that has been argued with for thousands of years. Zachary Leroux-Zique, the self-taught Breton archaeologist who became one of Carnac's major early documenters, stands as the modern human anchor of this file. He worked in the strange borderland between local memory, early archaeology, preservation, folklore, and institutional neglect. By the time modern experts arrived with notebooks and authority, many stones had already been damaged, reused, moved, mythologized, fenced, worshipped around, farmed around, or quietly absorbed into ordinary land use. Very normal. Nothing says minor prehistoric curiosity like needing an entire region to contain it. If this anomaly is verified in its full scale, then prehistoric architecture cannot be reduced to isolated tombs, shrines, or accidental piles of enthusiasm. Carnac forces a larger admission. Neolithic communities could organize space across kilometers. They could turn geography into memory. The site sits in Brittany, France, around Carnac and the shores of Morbihan. The broader megalithic landscape belongs to the Neolithic, roughly 5,000 to 2,300 BC. The region contains more than 3,000 standing stones across a large coastal zone. The monuments include alignments, dolmens, tumuli, and isolated menhirs. Their placement interacts with terrain, waterways, natural features, and repeated sightlines across the land. In one compressed reading window, Western France, Neolithic date range, more than 3,000 stones, kilometers of alignments, dolmens, burial mounds, coastal geography, and no written manual from the builders. That last detail is the insult. Enormous labor investment. Zero explanation. Prehistory once again refusing to attach a customer service guide. The physical contradiction is scale. Carnac is not just many stones. Many stones can happen naturally. Many stones arranged in rows, repeated across a landscape, integrated with tombs and mounds, maintained through generations, and made meaningful enough to survive as a regional system is a different animal. This is spatial order. It is planning spread across land, not a single impressive object sitting politely inside a museum caption. The engineering challenge was not only lifting stones, it was maintaining coherence. Individual menhirs could vary in size, but the system depended on repetition, alignment, direction, and placement. Someone had to choose routes. Someone had to understand the relationship between land and site. Someone had to decide that stone should mark memory at a scale larger than a household, larger than a village, larger than a single grave. That means social agreement over time. It means shared labor. It means tradition strong enough to outlive the people who began it. And that is where the primitive model starts to cough. Modern observers often search for one function because modern categories are lazy. Was Carnac a cemetery? A calendar? A ritual route? A territorial marker? A map of ancestors? A cosmic diagram? The question is useful, but the demand for one answer may be the modern mistake. Ancient landscapes did not have to obey the departmental organization of a university. The same monument could bind the dead, mark the sky, claim the land, guide movement, and teach identity. Efficiency, again, deeply rude to simple models. The political layer begins with control over meaning. Later institutions prefer monuments that can be classified. A tomb can be labeled, a temple can be managed. A calendar can be demonstrated with diagrams. A random mystery can be sold on postcards. But a landscape-scale memory system resists ownership. It does not fit cleanly into the categories that states, churches, museums, and tour boards prefer. That resistance produced erasure by simplification. Christian reinterpretation transformed older stones into legends, warnings, saints' stories, or defeated pagan remnants. Agriculture turned some monuments into obstacles. Roads cut through older spatial logic. Tourism converted deep ritual geography into scenic spectacle. Academic caution, while necessary, sometimes reduced the landscape into isolated problems because the whole system was too large, too damaged, and too silent to reconstruct with confidence. Silence is powerful. It lets everyone project. The threatened authority is not one medieval bishop or one modern government office. It is the modern hunger for prehistoric monuments to have one clean purpose. Carnac refuses that hunger. It behaves like memory, burial, territory, procession, cosmology, and social engineering all at once. That is uncomfortable because it suggests Neolithic people were not merely making monuments. They were making a mental map of the world large enough to walk through. The textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the math completely breaks down. They were just standing stones, we are told. Yes, more than 3,000 just stones, arranged across a coastal landscape for thousands of years, with tombs, alignments, mounds, and spatial order. Apparently, Neolithic Brittany suffered from a regional surplus of granite, free time, and highly organized confusion. To be fair, restraint matters. Carnac should not be turned into a prehistoric supercomputer, an alien landing grid, or a stone barcode for vanished cosmic engineers. The evidence does not require that. The sober alternatives are already strong enough. Perhaps the alignments structured ritual movement across the landscape. Perhaps they marked ancestral territories. Perhaps they encoded relationships between living communities, the dead, and natural features. Perhaps they worked as a ceremonial geography where repetition itself produced authority. The key is that Carnac does not need to reveal a single secret to remain extraordinary. Its scale is the evidence. Its persistence is the argument. So what were the stones doing? Guiding the living, housing the dead, marking the sky, claiming land, or disciplining memory? How much knowledge can survive without writing when it is built directly into terrain? And why do modern people assume that silence means simplicity, instead of recognizing that silence may only mean the archive was made of landscape? Carnac leaves us with a precise wound in the old timeline. Prehistoric architecture was not limited to buildings. It could organize entire regions. It could transform walking into remembering. It could make the land itself perform social order. From the long lines of Brittany, the investigation moves to a smaller stage surrounded by sea. There, on Malta and Gozo, island communities with limited land, limited resources, no writing, and no empire built freestanding stone temples centuries before the usual Mediterranean giants were ready to accept competition. Carnac gives us memory stretched across kilometers. Malta gives us complexity compressed onto an island. Chapter 5, Ġgantija and the Maltese Temples, the island that built before it explained. The fifth folder opens in the middle of the Mediterranean. You stand on Gozo, where the sea surrounds a small island with limited land, limited timber, limited resources, and apparently unlimited confidence in limestone. Before empires arrived with armies, coins, scripts, and the charming habit of naming everything after themselves, people here were already raising temples from stone. The modern anchor is Themistocles Jamet, physician, chemist, archaeologist, and one of the figures who helped drag Malta's prehistoric past out of folklore and colonial curiosity into systematic investigation. But the older human anchor is anonymous. That is the harder part. No royal name, no carved decree, no founding myth with a useful date. Just communities who built some of the world's earliest freestanding stone temples, then left us to argue over the silence. If this anomaly is verified in the way the architecture demands, then complexity cannot be reserved for river valleys, imperial capitals, and societies with enough bureaucracy to produce archives. Malta forces a smaller, sharper conclusion. A restricted island society without writing, metal tools, or urban monarchy could organize multi-century ritual architecture on a monumental scale. The Maltese temple tradition includes 7 major megalithic temples across Malta and Gozo. Ġgantija on Gozo contains 2 main temple structures enclosed within a shared outer wall. The major temple phases are generally dated around 3600 to 2500 BC. Heritage Malta notes plaster fragments with red ochre from Ġgantija interiors. The temples were built from local limestone in a small island environment where resources were constrained, and every large project competed with ordinary survival. In one uncomfortable cluster, 7 major temples, 2 structures within one boundary at Ġgantija, 3600 to 2500 BC, plastered interiors. Red ochre, local limestone, no written explanation. A small island, naturally, famous for relaxed behavior like organizing sacred architecture across centuries. The contradiction is not that people on Malta could move stone. Humans are stubborn, and stone eventually loses. The contradiction is the social system behind it. Monumental temples require planning, repeated labor, specialized knowledge, ritual continuity, quarrying, transport, architectural memory, and some shared belief strong enough to survive beyond individual lifetimes. On an island, this becomes even sharper. Space is limited, materials are local. Mistakes cannot simply be outsourced to the next valley. The temples are not crude piles of enthusiasm. Their plans include curving apses, controlled entrances, decorated surfaces, interior spaces, and evidence of carefully treated walls. Plaster and red ochre suggest not merely construction, but atmosphere. Someone cared about what the space felt like. Someone cared about color, texture, visibility, movement, and ritual focus. That means the builders were not only solving engineering problems, they were shaping experience. The primitive model prefers its ancient people practical and exhausted. Shelter, food, reproduction. Maybe a tool if the day was ambitious. Malta interrupts with ceremonial architecture that required a population to spend enormous energy on something that did not directly grow grain, catch fish, or repair a roof. This is not irrational. It is human. Communities build sacred places because sacred places organize fear, memory, status, fertility, death, identity, and belonging. In other words, all the invisible things that make a society obey itself. The engineering was difficult because mass had to be controlled without metal machinery. Limestone blocks had to be cut, shifted, lifted, balanced, and integrated into structures that endured. But the deeper challenge was institutional. Not state institutional, social institutional. A temple tradition lasting centuries means repeated teaching. It means that one generation passed on not just technique, but obligation. It means people inherited a building program as part of who they were. Then the tradition disappeared. That is the coldest fact in the case. After centuries of construction, the temple-building society vanished or transformed beyond recognition. The stones remained. The explanation did not. Explanation? This is not merely an architectural puzzle. It is the fossil of an institution without its institution. The political layer begins with geography. The Grand Mediterranean timeline loves centers: Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome. It prefers civilization to arrive from big places with writing, armies, and exportable arrogance. Islands are often treated as recipients: margins, stepping stones, places where culture washes ashore after being invented somewhere more important. Malta behaves badly inside that hierarchy. Its temples suggest that the island was not waiting for civilization to arrive by boat. It was already producing a ritual world with its own architectural grammar. That threatens a familiar map of prestige. If small islands can generate complexity internally, then civilization is not a gift delivered from the mainland. It is a behavior that appears wherever belief, labor, environment, and memory become dense enough. The erasure came through collapse, silence, and later imagination. Without texts, later people filled the gap with giants. The very name Ġgantija carries that memory of impossible builders. Folklore is not stupidity. It is what happens when ruins outlive explanation. But folklore also domesticates the problem. Giants are easier than social complexity. A giant moves a stone because he is large. A community moves a stone because it is organized. The second explanation is less magical and far more threatening. Museum labels can also shrink the mystery. Temple, fertility cult, ritual site, useful words. Also small cages. Once the label is attached, the public can walk past, nod, and feel informed. But the architecture keeps asking larger questions. What kind of authority coordinated the work? What kind of belief justified the cost? What kind of social stress caused the tradition to end? The textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the math completely breaks down. Small island societies were simple, of course. Simple people are famous for coordinating multi-century temple construction, plastered interiors, red ochre decoration, curved ritual chambers, and megalithic engineering. Very relaxed island behavior, practically beach tourism with orthostats. To be fair, Malta should not be inflated into a lost empire hiding in the sea. There is no need. The cautious alternatives are strong enough. Perhaps the temples were centers of fertility ritual, ancestor veneration, seasonal gathering, healing, food redistribution, or political negotiation disguised as religion. Perhaps the buildings concentrated social authority without producing kings. Perhaps the act of construction itself kept scattered communities tied to a shared island identity. That last possibility matters. Monumentality is not always about domination. Sometimes it is about cohesion. A society can build not because a ruler commands, but because participation itself creates belonging. Carrying stone becomes a vote. Entering the temple becomes memory. Painting the walls becomes continuity. Malta leaves 3 questions in the sea air. How much complexity can exist without writing to advertise itself? How many vanished institutions have been mislabeled as cults because we cannot read their rules? And when a society stops building its sacred architecture, does that mean it failed, evolved, or finally lost the story that held it together? The island's lesson is clean. Complexity does not require empire. Sometimes it requires a small territory, shared belief, disciplined labor, and a frightening amount of limestone. The absence of writing does not mean the absence of structure. It only means the structure had to be lived. And from Malta's sealed stone chambers, the investigation turns north to Ireland, where a mound older than the pyramids performs a trick so precise that it still embarrasses modern assumptions. If Ġgantija shows ritual architecture as social glue, Newgrange shows architecture doing something even stranger, turning sunlight into a key. Chapter 6, Newgrange, the tomb that turns sunlight into a key. Number 6 waits under a green mound in County Meath. You stand before Newgrange at Bruna Boini, where the entrance looks low, the stones look patient, and the whole structure appears almost too calm for the accusation it carries. Michael J. O'Kelly understood the problem when he excavated the site in the 1960s and 1970s. This was not merely a tomb. It was a machine that knew when the sun would return. At dawn around the winter solstice, a blade of sunlight enters through the roof box above the doorway, travels down the passage, and reaches the inner chamber. The moment is brief, it is also devastating. Because if this anomaly is verified in the strongest sense, then prehistoric Ireland was not waiting for Egypt, Mesopotamia, or any other certified supplier of civilization to teach it precision, ritual architecture, or cosmic timing. The official site is Newgrange, part of Bruna Boyne in County Meath, Ireland. It was built around 3200 BC. The mound measures approximately 85 meters in diameter and about 13 meters in height. Its stone passage runs roughly 19 meters into the mound, ending in an inner chamber. It predates the main stone circle of Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids. In one clean evidence cluster, 3200 BC, 85 meters wide, 13 meters high, 19-meter passage, winter solstice light, older than the pyramids. A burial mound, naturally, one with a solar appointment system. The physical contradiction is precision joined to meaning. Anyone can pile earth over the dead. Many societies did. But Newgrange choreographs a celestial event into architecture. That requires long-term observation of the sun's annual movement, understanding of horizon position, careful orientation of the passage, controlled entrance design, and enough construction discipline to make the light behave correctly inside a mound of stone and earth. The engineering challenge was not only mass, it was alignment. Stones had to be selected, transported, positioned, and stabilized. The mound had to be built to endure water, weight, and time. The passage had to remain coherent through pressure and settlement. The chamber had to receive light at a specific seasonal moment. A structure like this punishes approximation. Put the passage wrong, and the sun does not politely correct your theology. This is where textbook language starts to shrink. Tomb is accurate but insufficient. Yes, human remains were found in passage tombs of this tradition. Yes, death is central, but Newgrange refuses to be only a container for the dead. It behaves like an instrument. It links burial to the returning sun, darkness to renewal, ancestors to the calendar, and architecture to cosmic rhythm. The dead were not simply stored here. They were placed inside a timed relationship with the sky. That is not decoration. That is a worldview built in stone. The political layer is subtle because there is no king's name carved over the door. Later states loved to claim cosmic order. Pharaohs aligned themselves with gods. Kings built temples to prove heaven enjoyed their management style. Priests transformed calendars into authority. Newgrange shows that monumental timekeeping could emerge before those later political machines became visible. This is uncomfortable. It means power did not invent sacred time. It inherited an older human instinct to make the universe socially usable. Who benefited from Newgrange? Perhaps ritual specialists. Perhaps lineage groups. Perhaps communities who gathered at seasonal thresholds. Whoever controlled access to the mound may have controlled access to memory, death, renewal, and the dramatic return of light after the year's deepest darkness. That is not minor authority, it is emotional infrastructure. And then the modern world arrived with its own erasure method, admiration. Newgrange is so visually powerful that it risks becoming a postcard, a national treasure, a heritage site, a place people visit, photograph, and politely understand too quickly. Tourism does not have to destroy a monument to flatten it. Sometimes it only has to make the monument famous enough that the public stops feeling threatened by it. Restoration adds another complication. Modern reconstruction helps preserve and present the site, but it also shapes perception. The cleaner the monument looks, the easier it becomes to consume. The rougher questions get softened beneath visitor management, ticket slots, interpretive panels, and the quiet assumption that if a site has a car park, its mystery has been responsibly contained. Good. The Neolithic has been made accessible, always dangerous. The textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the math completely breaks down. Newgrange was a burial mound, correct. A burial mound with an 85-meter diameter, a 19-meter passage, megalithic art, engineered solar illumination, and a winter solstice event more reliable than several modern transportation systems. Apparently, the dead required punctual lighting. To be fair, restraint is necessary. Newgrange does not prove prehistoric Ireland had modern astronomy, hidden mathematics, or a lost priesthood with university accreditation. The solstice alignment is spectacular, but interpretation must remain careful. The cautious alternatives are already compelling. Perhaps the light marked rebirth after darkness. Perhaps it renewed the relationship between the living and the ancestors. Perhaps it legitimized seasonal gathering. Perhaps access to the illuminated chamber was controlled, turning architecture into ritual authority. The strongest reading is not that Newgrange was one thing. It was a tomb, a temple, a calendar, a memory device, and a political theater without needing those modern labels. Ancient people were not waiting for our categories before they used architecture intelligently. Newgrange leaves 3 questions glowing in the chamber. When people first learned to trap sunlight inside stone, were they measuring the heavens, comforting the dead, or organizing the living? If a monument can make time visible, who controls the meaning of that time? And why do we treat prehistoric precision as surprising when survival itself demanded generations of careful observation? The lesson is plain. Prehistoric architecture could choreograph time. It could make the year enter a room. It could turn sunlight into proof that the world had not abandoned the living. And from Ireland's winterlight, the trail moves east across the sea to another monument trapped under fame, speculation, and souvenir shop exhaustion. There, on Salisbury Plain, stones were not only raised, some were imported across astonishing distances, carrying pieces of distant landscapes into one of the most over-explained and under-understood structures on Earth. Newgrange turns the sun into a key. Stonehenge turns geography into a statement. Chapter 7. Stonehenge. The monument that imported its own mystery. Item number 7. You stand on Salisbury Plain, where Stonehenge rises from the grass with the exhausted confidence of a monument that has been explained too many times by people who arrived 12 minutes ago. Druids have been assigned to it, aliens have been blamed for it, tourists have circled it, national identity has polished it into an icon. Meanwhile, the stones themselves continue doing the most irritating thing evidence can do. They remain specific. Mike Parker Pearson, Rob Eichser, Richard Bevins, and the broader Stonehenge research community have helped drag the site away from the lazy image of an isolated mystery circle. Their work places Stonehenge inside a larger Neolithic Britain. Connected landscapes, distant quarries, ceremonial routes, settlements, burials, and material networks. The pressure is immense because Stonehenge is not just an archaeological site. It is a public hallucination with a parking system. If this anomaly is verified in its strongest form, then Stonehenge does not merely show that Neolithic people could raise heavy stones. It shows that communities without later state machinery could assemble a monument from geography itself, importing matter, meaning, and political relationships across Britain before the usual institutions arrived to take credit for coordination. The central stone settings were raised around 2500 BC. The average sarsen stone weighs about 25 tons. The blue stones weigh roughly 2 to 5 tons and came from the Preseli Hills in Wales. The heel stone weighs over 30 tons. And 2024 mineral analysis linked the 6-ton altar stone not to Wales as once suspected, but to Scotland's Orcadian Basin, hundreds of kilometers away. In one reading window, 2500 BC, 25-ton sarsens, 2 to 5-ton blue stones, a 30-ton heel stone, a 6-ton altar stone, Wales, Scotland, Salisbury Plain. A local monument, then. If local includes moving symbolic geology across a large island because apparently Neolithic logistics enjoyed pain, the physical contradiction begins with transport. Quarrying stone is difficult. Shaping it is difficult. Moving it over land and water is difficult. Raising it upright is difficult. Joining it into a coherent architectural arrangement is difficult. Aligning it within a wider ceremonial landscape is difficult. Doing all of this while leaving no administrative archive is extremely rude. Stonehenge required more than muscle. Muscle alone produces injury, not architecture. The builders needed routes, timing, food supply, technical knowledge, repeated labor gatherings, leadership, negotiation, and a shared reason powerful enough to make people move stones that any sensible person would have left where nature placed them. The stones did not travel because someone was bored. They traveled because their origins mattered. That is the deeper point. Stonehenge was not simply built from stone. It was assembled from places. The sarsens tied the monument to the local chalk landscape. The blue stones connected it to Wales. The altar stone, if traced to Scotland's Orcadian Basin, stretches the symbolic map even farther. These were not neutral materials. They were fragments of distant terrain brought into one ritual center. Stonehenge becomes a political geography made visible. The primitive model prefers prehistoric communities to be local, small, and socially narrow. Stonehenge breaks that. It implies long-distance networks, shared mythologies, exchange routes, interregional contact, or acts of alliance and authority that we can no longer fully reconstruct. The monument is not merely an engineering question. It is a question of why different regions mattered to each other before Britain had kings, parliaments, passports, or anyone demanding that travelers remove their shoes at security. The political layer is hidden beneath fame. Stonehenge has been erased by overexposure. That sounds impossible, but it is exactly what happens. A monument becomes so famous that people stop seeing the problem. It becomes a logo, a desktop background, a chapter opener, a mystery postcard, a solstice news segment, a place where the public arrives already satisfied with the word ancient. Fame domesticates threat. The heritage industry also has its own quiet power. Stonehenge becomes mystery merchandise, while labor systems, regional relationships, quarrying strategies, and social organization fade into the background. The public is invited to admire the stones, not to ask what kind of society could make people care enough to drag them into position. Awe is permitted. Analysis is optional. The souvenir shop is prepared. There is also a deeper institutional discomfort. For centuries, explanations tried to attach Stonehenge to later groups because later groups felt easier to respect. Druids were convenient. Classical imagination was convenient. Mystical priesthoods were convenient. Actual Neolithic builders were less convenient because they forced the admission that people without writing or metal tools could generate long-range symbolic projects of staggering complexity. That admission still bothers modern arrogance. We prefer intelligence to leave documents. We prefer organization to look like government. We prefer power to wear a crown, stamp a coin, or build a palace. Stonehenge gives us coordination without that costume. It asks us to recognize political behavior before formal politics becomes visible. The textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the math completely breaks down. Nobody knows how they moved the stones, This phrase is often delivered as if ignorance itself were a conclusion. It is not. It is a receipt for unfinished research. The better question is not whether Neolithic people had help from the sky. The better question is why they cared enough to move multi-ton stones across distances that make modern people complain about airport transfers. To be fair, the mainstream caution is necessary. Stonehenge should not be treated as a solved equation or an occult vending machine. It was likely many things across many phases: burial landscape, ceremonial center, solar monument, territorial symbol, ancestral theater, gathering place, and political project. The cautious alternatives are more interesting than the sensational ones. Perhaps the stones embodied ancestral origins. Perhaps their movement united distant communities through labor. Perhaps bringing stones from Wales and Scotland transformed the monument into a negotiated map of belonging. Perhaps the difficulty was the point. That last possibility matters. Monumental labor can create society while pretending merely to express it. When people work together on something unnecessary for survival but essential for meaning, they become tied to one another by exhaustion, memory, and obligation. Stonehenge may not just record a society, it may have helped manufacture one. So why were distant stones more powerful than local ones? What kind of network could organize transport across such distances without leaving written orders behind? And if Stonehenge was a map of relationships, then was its real monument the stone circle? Or the human network required to build it? The lesson is blunt. Lesson: Stonehenge is not mysterious because prehistoric people were incapable. It is mysterious because they were capable in ways that do not fit our preferred evidence. It is not only an engineering achievement. It is prehistoric political geography built in stone. From Salisbury Plain, the investigation moves north to Orkney, where the problem becomes domestic instead of ceremonial. No towering sarsens. No national icon polished by centuries of speculation. Just stone houses, beds, hearths, shelves, passages, and drains. Stonehenge shows a society organizing sacred geography. Skara Brae shows something even more difficult for the old model to absorb: ordinary life designed to last. Chapter 8. Skara Brae. The village with furniture. Older than empires. The 8th fragment of our investigation is pulled from sand by a storm. You stand on mainland Orkney in 1850, where the wind has torn open the coast near Scale Bay and exposed something that should have been fragile, temporary, and gone. Instead, the ground reveals houses, stone houses, with beds, hearths, shelves, passages, storage spaces. The domestic life of the Neolithic, caught in place like someone left the room and forgot to come back for 5,000 years. William Watt of Scale, the local landowner, becomes the modern anchor of this discovery. He did not find a palace. He did not uncover a royal tomb packed with gold and flattering lies. He found ordinary architecture, which is more dangerous. Palaces tell us what rulers wanted remembered. Homes tell us what societies actually had to organize every day. If this anomaly is verified in the way the village demands, then sophistication cannot be measured only by temples, kings, weapons, pyramids, or the ability of elites to carve their names into expensive surfaces. Skara Brae asks a colder question. What if civilization is visible not in royal propaganda, but in the design of daily life? The site is Skara Brae, on mainland, Orkney, Scotland. It forms part of the Heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site. It dates to roughly 5,000 years ago. Its houses preserve stone dressers, box beds, central hearths, passageways, storage spaces, and evidence of drainage. Historic Environment Scotland describes it as one of the best preserved Neolithic settlements in Western Europe. In one compressed file, Orkney, 5,000 years old, stone-built houses, built-in furniture, hearths, passages, drainage, no palace, no king list, no king. No imperial administrator taking credit for the shelving. A primitive village, obviously, the kind with interior planning. The physical contradiction is domestic competence. The old model can tolerate prehistoric people building ritual structures, because ritual can be filed under mystery and then safely ignored. But Skara Brae is not primarily a spectacle of death or worship. It is ordinary life made durable. The houses are planned. The furniture is built into the architecture. The hearths occupy central positions. Passageways connect spaces. The layout suggests shared habits, repeated forms, and a community that knew what a home should do. That is not trivial. Domestic architecture requires standards. Standards imply social continuity. If houses share forms, then people were not improvising shelter one panic at a time. They were reproducing a pattern. They knew where heat belonged, where sleeping belonged, where objects belonged, where movement belonged, and how private or semi-private life should be arranged. This is culture, but not the decorative kind. This is culture as floor plan. The engineering was not impossible because the structures reached the sky. They did not. It was difficult because they solved ordinary problems with discipline. Wind, cold, storage, fire, waste, movement, privacy, repair, community proximity. Orkney is not gentle. A settlement here needed protection from weather and access to resources, but it also needed internal order. A badly planned house is not romantic. It is just a slow argument with the climate. Skara Brae shows people winning that argument. The political layer is where the site becomes quietly offensive. History has long been addicted to elite evidence. Kings are easy. Temples are easy. Tombs are easy. Weapons are easy. They announce power in large, blunt letters. Domestic spaces are softer. They do not shout. They do not usually provide a heroic statue pointing at something. They reveal competence without spectacle, and that makes them easier to underestimate. But a society that designs ordinary life is not simple. Built-in furniture means planning around use. Drainage means concern for sanitation and comfort. Repeated house forms mean shared expectations. Covered or connected passages suggest coordinated settlement planning. Skara Brae does not need a throne room to show organization. The organization is in the beds. That is the threat. It undermines the obsession with rulers as the only proof of civilization. If sophistication appears in hearths, shelves, storage, and drains, then the story of progress becomes less flattering to elites. Civilization is no longer something handed down from palaces. It becomes something assembled by households, maintained by routines, and made visible in the architecture of ordinary survival. The erasure came from sand, storms, and taste. Sand preserved the village but also concealed it. Storms revealed it but also reminded everyone how fragile the coast can be. Public imagination then performed its usual filtering. Monumental stones attract awe. Tombs attract mystery. Temples attract interpretation. Houses attract the phrase daily life, which sounds small until one remembers that daily life is where every society actually proves whether it works. The textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the math completely breaks down. Neolithic people lived in primitive huts. Skara Brae replies with stone furniture, built-in storage, central hearths, passageways, and drainage. Primitive, yes, the same way a submarine is just a damp hallway. To be fair, Skara Brae should not be inflated into a lost city or a utopian village where everyone discussed drainage with spiritual equality. We do not know its full social structure. Domestic architecture can hide hierarchy as easily as it reveals comfort. The cautious alternatives are enough. Perhaps the standardized houses reflect kin groups with shared building traditions. Perhaps the settlement layout managed cooperation in a harsh environment. Perhaps the furniture arrangement encoded social roles, storage practices, or ritual meanings we can no longer separate from ordinary use. Perhaps the village shows that home itself was already an institution. That last possibility matters. A home is not just a shelter. It is a training device. It teaches where people sleep, gather, cook, store, remember, and belong. Multiply that across a settlement, and domestic architecture becomes social reproduction in stone. The village does not need a written law. The layout teaches behavior every day. Skara Brae leaves 3 questions under the Orkney sky. If ordinary houses can preserve social intelligence better than royal monuments, why do we keep treating domestic life as secondary evidence? How many prehistoric societies have been called simple because their most important institutions were households, not palaces? And if civilization begins where humans organize repeated life, then why do kings get so much credit for arriving late and standing on top of it? The lesson is severe but useful. Complexity does not always announce itself with towers. Sometimes it looks like a bed, a shelf, a hearth, and a drain. Skara Brae makes domestic life the evidence of civilization, not royal propaganda. And from these stone houses in the North Atlantic, the investigation crosses to the lower Mississippi Valley, where another assumption breaks in a different material. Not stone circles, not temples, not tombs, earth. Vast ridges, mounds, plazas, and collective labor built by hunter-fisher-gatherers who were supposedly too mobile for mega-projects. Skara Brae shows ordinary life engineered to last. Poverty Point shows mobility itself organizing monumentality. Chapter 9. Poverty Point. The Hunter-Gatherer Megaproject. Number 9 begins in northeastern Louisiana, where the ground itself has been shaped into argument. You stand at Poverty Point looking across ridges, mounds, and open space arranged with a quiet confidence that does not care whether later historians were emotionally prepared. There are no pyramids of cut stone here. No palace walls. No carved king declaring that he alone made the earth behave. There is only earthwork geometry, spread across the landscape by people who were not supposed to be doing this sort of thing. Tristram R. Kidder and Anthony Ortman anchor the modern research side of this file, especially through work that forced a more serious look at rapid mound construction, planning, and the complexity of hunter-gatherer societies. But the older human anchor belongs to the builders themselves. Hunter-fisher-gatherer communities of the lower Mississippi Valley, organizing labor, gathering people, moving soil, shaping ceremonial space, and quietly destroying the lazy assumption that agriculture must come first. If this anomaly is verified in its strongest form, then one of the most stubborn equations in prehistory breaks apart. Farming surplus equals hierarchy, hierarchy equals public works equals civilization. Poverty Point refuses that math. It shows monumentality without the expected agricultural state machinery. The site stands in northeastern Louisiana in the United States. It dates to approximately 3,700 to 3,100 years before present. It was built by hunter-fisher-gatherer communities. The main complex includes 5 mounds, 6 concentric semi-elliptical ridges, and a central plaza. Louisiana State Parks describes the central ridges as 6 C-shaped rows divided by aisles, in one compact evidence cluster. Lower Mississippi Valley, 3,700 to 3,100 years before present, hunter-fisher-gatherers, 5 mounds, 6 C-shaped ridges, divided aisles, central plaza. No farming kingdom waiting in the wings. A mobile society, apparently. Very mobile. Mobile enough to rearrange the ground. The contradiction is not merely size. Humans can move dirt. The contradiction is organization. Earthworks demand planning, repeated labor, spatial vision, and a reason to bring people together at scale. A mound is not a natural accident with ambition. A plaza does not appear because several families wandered into a clearing and collectively misunderstood landscaping. The ridges, mounds, and open areas imply design, use, memory, and repeated gathering. This becomes a serious problem for the agricultural surplus model. Standard explanations often treat farming as the engine that produces everything impressive. Crops create surplus. Surplus feeds specialists. Specialists build monuments. Monuments justify elites. Elites become history because elites are excellent at leaving objects that flatter them. Poverty Point offers a different engine. Abundant riverine environments, fishing, hunting, gathering, seasonal movement, exchange networks, ritual obligations, and social gatherings may have produced enough stability and coordination without full dependence on agriculture. The builders did not need to become a grain state to create a monumental center. They needed a landscape rich enough to support gatherings and a social world meaningful enough to make those gatherings repeat. The engineering difficulty was in volume, layout, and timing. Soil had to be dug, carried, placed, shaped, and compacted. Work had to be coordinated across groups. Food had to be available. Routes had to connect people and materials. The design had to remain legible through construction. And the site had to matter enough that communities returned to it, used it, and maintained its significance. This was not architecture as shelter. It was architecture as social magnet. That phrase matters. A monument does not only express society. Sometimes it gathers society into being. Poverty Point may have worked as a ceremonial center, exchange hub, residential zone, social arena, and identity marker. It could have drawn people from different places into a shared landscape where trade, ritual, alliance, obligation, and display converged. The plaza was not empty space. It was a stage. The political layer is older and uglier than the soil itself. Indigenous earthworks in North America were long minimized, misattributed, or treated as curiosities rather than architecture. Colonial narratives struggled to accept that indigenous peoples built complex monumental landscapes, so explanations drifted toward vanished races, outsiders, biblical fantasies, or vague mystery. Anything was preferable to giving native builders full intellectual credit. Apparently, the continent could contain massive earthworks, but not the people capable of designing them. A very convenient blindness. This is erasure by refusal. It does not always deny the monument exists, it denies what the monument means. Earth becomes mound. Planning becomes custom. A complexity becomes ceremony. Spoken in a tone that implies ceremony is what people do when they have not yet discovered real intelligence. But ceremony can organize labor. Exchange can organize geography. Seasonal gathering can organize politics. A society does not need a palace to have power. It only needs a system that makes people show up. The threatened model is not just old world arrogance. It is the narrower American assumption that complexity must resemble later Mesoamerican cities or Andean empires before it counts. Stone temples, royal tombs, armies, maize fields, roads, inscriptions. Poverty Point says no. Complexity can be earthen, collective, seasonal, decentralized, and still massive. It can leave ridges instead of royal propaganda. It can build a center without making a king convenient for the textbook. The textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the math completely breaks down. Hunter-gatherers were too mobile for monuments. Apparently not too mobile to build concentric ridges, mounds, plazas, and one of the most impressive archaic earthwork landscapes in North America. But yes, let us keep calling them simple because they forgot to install a gift shop. To be fair, Poverty Point should not be inflated into a hidden empire. The evidence does not require a lost monarchy, secret priesthood, or missing script. The cautious alternatives are better. Perhaps it was a major ceremonial gathering place. Perhaps it coordinated long-distance exchange. Perhaps its ridges organized residence, ritual movement, or social ranking in ways that did not harden into a state. Perhaps its power came precisely from being collective rather than imperial. That possibility is dangerous because it means monumentality does not always require command from above. Sometimes it can emerge from repeated participation. People gather, they trade, they feast, they mourn, they compete, they remember, they move Earth. Over time, the landscape becomes a record of shared effort, and shared effort becomes authority. Poverty Point leaves 3 questions carved into the soil. If hunter-fisher-gatherers could build at this scale, why do we keep using agriculture as the entrance exam for complexity? How many indigenous monuments were intellectually buried because colonial observers could not imagine their builders honestly? And if a society can organize massive public works without a state, then what exactly are states claiming to have invented? The lesson is firm. Agriculture is not the only road to complexity. Monumentality can grow from movement, gathering, exchange, and obligation. Poverty Point breaks the lazy link between farming and civilization by showing that people can be mobile, flexible, and still capable of shaping the earth into a shared idea. And from the lower Mississippi, the final file moves south across the Americas to Peru's Supe Valley, where the problem becomes even harder to dismiss. There, a city rises before the familiar American timeline is ready, with pyramidal structures, sunken courts, vast planning, and a civilization that does not follow the old world script. Poverty Point shows hunter-gatherers building monumentality. Caral-Supe asks whether the Americas had already built a city before the textbook knew where to put it. Chapter 10. Caral-Supe. The city before the usual American timeline. The final case file opens in Peru's Supe Valley. You stand about 23 kilometers inland from the Pacific coast, where the desert holds a city so old that the familiar American timeline starts looking like a poorly edited summary. Around you are pyramidal structures, sunken circular courts, plazas, terraces, and the remains of an urban experiment that arrived before many people were taught to expect cities in the Americas at all. Ruth Shady Solis becomes the modern human anchor of this file. Her work helped force Caral into the global conversation about early civilization. Not as a footnote to later Andean empires, not as a warm-up act for the Inca, but as a major urban society in its own right. That distinction matters. Civilizations do not become real only when tourists can name their final imperial version. If this anomaly is verified in the way the site demands, then the old story of American complexity developing late, slowly, and only under the familiar signs of ceramics, warfare, and imperial command begins to fail. Caral-Supe does not ask whether the Americas eventually built civilizations. It asks why we keep acting surprised that they began experimenting with urban life so early. The official site is the sacred city of Caral-Supe, in the Supe Valley of Peru. It lies roughly 23 kilometers inland from the Pacific. UNESCO describes the archaeological zone as covering about 626 hectares. It is approximately 5,000 years old. The site includes 6 large pyramidal structures and sunken circular courts. A quipu found there indicates complex information recording traditions. In one compact file, Peru, Supe Valley, 23 kilometers from the coast, 626 hectares, 5,000 years old, 6 pyramidal structures, sunken courts, quipu, no obvious dependence on the classic old world script of civilization. Very late, of course. Practically yesterday, if your calendar was designed by a pyramid. The physical contradiction is urban planning before the expected package. Caral had monumental architecture, large public spaces, organized construction, social coordination, and evidence of information management in the late Archaic period. Yet it challenges the checklist people often use to recognize civilization. Where are the ceramics? Where is the obvious militarized state? Where are the heroic battle scenes? Where is the ruler helpfully carving his resume into stone? Caral is rude enough not to provide the usual paperwork. The engineering problem begins with scale. A 626-hectare sacred urban landscape is not a village that accidentally became photogenic. Pyramidal structures required organized labor, planning, material movement, design memory, and maintenance. Sunken circular courts required excavation, architectural control, and repeated communal use. The site had to integrate buildings, open spaces, movement, ritual, and probably administrative or symbolic systems. A city is not just a cluster of structures. It is a machine for organizing people. And Caral organized without following the script later civilizations made famous. It appears to have depended heavily on ritual authority, exchange networks, ideology, labor coordination, and relationships between inland agricultural zones and coastal resources. This is not the cartoon version of civilization where farming appears. Someone invents a crown, soldiers start marching, and architecture becomes tall because insecurity requires masonry. Caral suggests another pathway: civic life built through ritual gathering, resource exchange, and social obligation rather than battlefield spectacle. That is a serious problem for the war and state model. Many histories like violence because violence leaves obvious marks: fortifications, weapons, burn layers. Victors, defeated bodies. The evidence is dramatic and therefore easy to narrate. Caral's power seems less theatrical. It may have organized society through ceremony, architecture, production, distribution, and controlled meaning. Less blood on the wall. More administration hidden inside sacred space, less cinematic, more effective. Humans do this often. When force is unnecessary, ideology is cheaper. The Quipu deepens the problem. A system of knotted cords associated with information recording appears in the broader Andean world. And its presence at Caral points toward complex traditions of memory, counting, or administration that do not depend on alphabetic writing. This is devastating to narrow definitions of civilization. If a society does not write like Mesopotamia or Egypt, modern observers sometimes behave as if it did not record information at all. The assumption is not analysis. It is cultural laziness wearing glasses. The political layer is comparison. Caral was not erased because it was invisible. It was diminished by the gravitational pull of later fame. The Inca became the name everyone remembers. Machu Picchu became the image. Imperial roads, royal authority, Spanish conquest, and colonial chronicles became the recognizable Andean story. Older societies were compressed into prefaces, as if their main function was to stand quietly before the empires with better publicity. Caral refuses that role. It says the Andes were not waiting thousands of years for civilization to mature into something textbook-friendly. They were already testing forms of civic organization, monumentality, ritual authority, and information systems long before the names most people recognize. That makes the timeline deeper. It also makes it less comfortable because it removes the illusion that civilization has one correct sequence. There is also an old world bias buried inside the discussion. Civilization is often judged by categories inherited from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. Writing, cities, kings, war, grain states, monumental temples, armies, bureaucracies. Caral shares some features and refuses others. That refusal is not deficiency, it is difference. A civilization does not fail because it does not cosplay as Sumer. The textbook narrative is highly elegant and perfectly logical, until the math completely breaks down. The Americas developed complex civilization much later. Caral responds with pyramids, plazas, urban planning, sunken courts, long-distance exchange, and a 5,000-year-old civic landscape. Very late, almost embarrassingly punctual. To be fair, Caral should not be turned into a utopia, a pacifist paradise, or a mystical mother city that explains all later Andean culture by itself. The absence of obvious warfare does not mean the absence of conflict. Ritual authority can be coercive. Exchange systems can produce inequality. Monumental architecture can inspire community and discipline it at the same time. Stones and earth do not become innocent because no sword is lying nearby. The cautious alternatives are stronger. Perhaps Caral organized labor through religious obligation. Perhaps elites controlled ritual knowledge and resource flows. Perhaps inland cotton, agricultural production, and coastal fishing economies formed a powerful exchange system. Perhaps public architecture made social hierarchy feel natural by embedding it into ceremony. Perhaps the city's genius was not that it avoided power, but that it made power look like order. That possibility matters because it returns the investigation to the central question. These structures do not prove that prehistory was impossible. They prove that our simplified model was too small. Caral does not need aliens, lost races, or a secret global master plan. It only needs real people, observant, organized, ambitious, symbolic, practical, competitive, cooperative, and fully capable of building complexity before later historians granted them permission. Caral leaves 3 final questions on the desert floor. If civilization can emerge without following the Old World sequence, why is that sequence still treated as the default? How many early societies have been misread because their power did not advertise itself through war, kings, or familiar writing? And if Caral was already building urban life 5,000 years ago, then what else has been compressed into the word prehistory simply because it makes the timeline easier to teach? The lesson is unavoidable. Civilization is not a single road. It is a set of human behaviors that can assemble in different orders under different pressures. Caral-Supe proves that the Americas did not need to imitate the Old World to become complex. They had their own script, written in pyramids, courts, labor, memory, and silence. And with that final city, the case files close on the same uncomfortable verdict. The structures were never the real impossibility. The real impossibility was the model that needed their builders to be smaller than they were. Outro. The real crime scene was the timeline. You have reached the end of 10 files, which means you already did something the simplified timeline quietly discourages. You kept looking after the easy explanation stopped working. That matters. Not because these structures prove aliens, Atlantis, vanished master races, or any other convenient fantasy with better marketing than evidence. They do not. The colder conclusion is more insulting to modern arrogance. Real prehistoric people were not waiting to become intelligent. They were already observing, planning, gathering, engineering, remembering, arguing, burying, aligning, building, and organizing meaning into stone, earth, sunlight, and space. Göbekli Tepe did not need a state to make ritual powerful. Jericho did not need paperwork to produce public works. Nabta Playa did not need pharaohs to watch the sky. Carnac did not need writing to turn landscape into memory. Malta did not need empire to build sacred architecture. Newgrange did not need pyramids to choreograph sunlight. Stonehenge did not need a modern logistics department to move symbolic geology. Skara Brae did not need kings to design daily life. Poverty Point did not need agriculture to organize monumentality. Caral-Supe did not need the Old World script to become a city. The pattern is not supernatural, it is worse. It is human. The real mystery was never who secretly helped them. That question often reveals more about us than about them. It shows how quickly modern people become uncomfortable when prehistoric humans behave like full humans, intelligent, social, symbolic, ambitious, capable of cooperation, and occasionally reckless enough to spend generations moving heavy objects for invisible reasons. The official staircase of progress is useful in classrooms because it is simple: farming, villages, temples, cities, states. Clean, linear, comfortable. Also incomplete. The ground keeps producing evidence that human complexity did not always wait for the approved order. Sometimes ritual came before settlement. Sometimes infrastructure came before administration. Sometimes astronomy came from survival. Sometimes domestic architecture carried civilization more honestly than royal monuments. So the verdict is precise. These prehistoric structures should not exist only inside the lazy model of prehistory that treats early humans as technically limited, socially small, and intellectually reactive. Outside that model, they exist perfectly well. They are not impossible. Our assumptions were too small. If you made it this far, you are probably wired to notice cracks in clean narratives. Good. Keep that defect. Subscribe to Minimal Histories and defend your theory in the comments like a civilized person standing beside a 5,000-year-old monument with no user manual. Because the oldest evidence keeps saying the same thing. Humanity did not become complex when history began writing itself down. Humanity was already complex. Writing just arrived late and started taking minutes.